Hello, this is the Introduction to Theory lecture for Debate Nebraska. First, what is theory? Theory is an argument in debate that proposes a rule or model for debate, for the round itself, or for debate in general. Typically, it's regarded as a debate about debate because you're debating about how debate should function, what arguments you get to make in the debate space, how you should engage in these arguments, etc. Thus, it's commonly referred to as the highest layer in the debate round because you're debating about debate itself. Next, the parts of the theory shell. So a theory shell is basically how you make a theory argument, how theory is deployed in the round, and the parts of it are first, the interpretation, second, the violation, third, the standards, fourth, the voters, and fifth, the paradigm issues. So first is the interpretation. The interpretation is essentially the rule or model of debate that you propose. Basically, with conditionality, it would look like interpretation, the negative may not read any conditional advocacies. Conditionality being that the negative debater gets the ability to drop or kick out of certain advocacies, specifically solvency advocacies like a counterplan or the alternative of a critique, etc. And this interpretation basically says the negative may not be able to kick out, they may not be able to drop it from the flow and have to engage in it or whatnot. So next is the violation. Essentially, it's how your opponent breaks the rule or the interpretation you set for debate. It's how they violate the interpretation, hence the name violation. So going back to the conditionality example, it will look something like violation, the neg reads a conditional counterclaim, proved by cross-examination. This is an obvious violation of the interpretation because you're saying your interpretation says the negative should not read conditional advocacies, but then they go ahead and read a conditional counterclaim. That's obviously violating your interpretation, and that would be the violation. Next are the standards. The standards talk about why your interpretation matters in the round or as a model for debate. It explains the abuse and the impacts and implications of the violation that it has in the round. So common standards would look like, first is time skew. Time skew talks about how there's some time allocation equality or inequality that you create in the round. It's a skew in time you spend on certain arguments, or it's a skew in time allocation, etc. i.e. of a standard for time skew could look like time skew. The negative makes us more time crunched, or they limit the amount of time we have, they basically create some kind of skew in terms of time allocation, and that's bad. Next is strat skew, which talks about how there's some sort of strategical unfairness in the round, i.e. the negative gets a strategical advantage over us, which is unfair and should be standard for the theory shell. Next is ground. It's another sort of fairness issue. It deals with fairness over access to offense, i.e. the negative and affirmative should both have equal access to offense in the round. Limiting ground would be articulated as a standard, and it would be articulated as something bad that violates the theory shell because you're limiting ground, you're limiting access to offense that we get, and that's unfair. Next is clash. Unlike time skew, strat skew, or ground, clash does more of an educational value. It deals with not as much as fairness, but rather more of the educational aspects in the round, because clash is about contestation and testing and discourse over positions in the round, arguing about arguments. Clash basically makes up what debate is all about. It makes up all the educational value in debate. It's clashing over these arguments, testing over these arguments. When we debate, clash is what you think of when you think of debate, sort of. And an instance of this being a standard would be something like you limit clash, and that's bad because it destroys education in the debate space. Next is reciprocity. This is another fairness issue. Basically deals with having both debaters being given equal burdens for the round, having equal footing. It really values this sort of equality. Violating reciprocity would look like you get access to an argument, but we don't. That's obviously unfair because that gives us different burdens. That gives us unequal footing since you get access to this argument, but I don't, and that's unfair. Prep skew basically deals with preparation before round or during round, and deals with preparation burden that you place on your opponent or that you place on us as a debater. Essentially, a violation of this would look like, or how this would look like as a standard, would be like prep skew. The negative explodes the prep burden for the affirmative since you have to prep out all these positions. That's super unfair, and that should be a voting issue. So for standard for conditionality, it would look something like clash. So basically, clash could be a standard for conditionality. An example could be clash. Kondo stops clash since instead of engaging in debate over the counterplan, you just kick out of it instead, which stops educational discourse as a voting issue, and that's how you could give a standard for your conditionality theory shell, which would be something like clash. We'll go on to voters. So voters are sort of the big picture values for the debate or for the theory shell and your interpretation. It sort of talks about why your standards matter, the most common of which are education and fairness. Education obviously referring to educational value in the round and sort of knowledge and information you gain from debate. Fairness just talking about how you get equal access or like dealing with equality issues in the round and how everything should be fair. So the two most common justifications for education as a voter are it being the sole purpose of debate and that schools would stop funding debate if it's uneducational. And basically, with the sole purpose of debate, it just talks about how education is the sole reason why debate exists. We debate to gain more knowledge and information about certain topics, and that's intrinsically valuable. The school stop funding argument just talks about how if debate was not educational, schools would stop funding it because schools only fund educational activities like, I don't know, chess club, math club, science club, etc. Schools will stop funding debate if it became uneducational. That destroys debate because obviously we wouldn't have funding for debate, and then we can't debate. Next is fairness. The two most common justifications for that are unfair rounds deck participation, and that fairness is constitutive of any competitive activity. So for unfair rounds deck participation is talking about if we have debaters debating in unfair rounds, that discourages participation because no one wants to debate in an unfair round, and alternatively, participation is key to debate's existence. Without participation, debate will not exist, which means that fairness should be an intrinsic issue or intrinsic value in debate because debate will not exist if people stop participating because unfair rounds are causing that. Constitutive basically talks about how fairness is constitutive of competitive activities. Every competitive activity like sports or whatnot all have fairness as an intrinsic value. Fairness is just intrinsically valuable and constitutive of all these activities like debate, meaning that it should be valued in the round and function as a voter. Next are the paradigm issues. So paradigm issues talk about the implications of the shell and extra details of it, and they typically come at the end of the shell. So three most common paradigm issues deal with drop the debater versus drop the argument, no RVIs versus RVIs, and competing interps versus reasonability. So drop the debater versus drop the argument talks about the implication of how the shell should whether drop the debater or drop your opponent or just drop the argument they make that's abusive. Drop the debater would be like, if they violate the shell, they have some kind of abuse in the round, you should drop them, you should downvote them for this, give me the dub, just drop the debater. Drop the argument would be like, you should drop the argument that they made was abusive instead of dropping the debater as a whole. For conditionality, it would be a good example for this because if the negative reads a conditional advocacy like a conditional counterplan, drop the debater would be like, since they were abusive with a conditional counterplan, you should drop the debater as a whole. But drop the argument would be like, you should just drop the counterplan that they read because that's the only abusive part that was articulated in the theory shell. So no RVIs versus RVIs. The RVI talks about basically it's an acronym for reverse voting issue. It's saying that if your opponent is able to contest your shell and beat it back or win your shell, or win like a counter interpretation for it, or win that it's not a good shell, or like when it's a false shell, they win the round basically. It gets sort of a reciprocity issue with access to theory as a voting issue. No RVIs would look like even if your opponent wins the shell is false, they don't get to win the round. Having them have the RVI would look like, oh, we get the RVI. If we beat back the shell, we win the round. So competing interprets versus reasonability. This part just talks about how competing interpretations is regarding, or I guess, yeah, competing interpretations versus reasonability talks about how your opponent should contest the shell. Competing interpretation says that your opponent, in order to contest the shell, must provide a counter model of debate or a counter interpretation. So for conditionality, your interpretation might be the negative may not read any conditional advocacies, and the negative counter interpretation or the competing interp would look something like interpretation or counter interpretation rather. The negative may read conditional advocacies. And reasonability would be another sort of way to contest a theory shell, or another sort of way your opponent should contest it or access it. Basically saying, if we reasonably meet the or we have a reasonable interpretation, then that's good is good enough, and we meet the shell, and it shouldn't be evaluated as a voting issue. Alright, so here is an example of a conditionality theory shell. As you can see, we have the interpretation, which is the negative may not read any conditional advocacies, setting the rule for debate. Next, we obviously have the violation, which is they read a conditional counterclaim, they can see that in cross-X, so they violate the shell. Next are the standards. You can see we have 3 standards. First is the time skew standard. Conditionality moots parts of the time crunch to 1 AR by having the negative kick out of offense, basically saying that they create some kind of time skew because they're able to kick out of offense that we spend a lot of time on. Next is clash, which is the second standard, talking about how they can just stop clash by kicking it out instead of debating it. And that decks education, and you should prefer depth of education over breadth, and I'm deterred from making in-depth arguments on the counterclaim in fear of you just kicking out of it and wasting my time. Basically, this talks about how you prevent clash because you kick out of an argument, and you're not debating about this argument, which stops educational discourse over it. Next is the reciprocity, which is the last and third and last standard that we have here. It talks about how we get one unconditional route to the ballot, but they don't, and that it's irreciprocal since we cannot kick out of whole solemnity advocates like they can. So this will look like if the advocates to read a plan, it's obviously unconditional. The AF is unconditional. You can't kick out of the AF entirely unless obviously you want to lose or something, or maybe in special circumstances you can. But the negative has obviously knows the neg or the AF is not going to kick out of the entire AF. Well, very likely that they won't, but they get multiple conditional routes, or they get a sort of conditional route to the ballot that we don't. That's irreciprocal. That's unfair. It does not provide us equal footing or equal burdens in the round, and that acts as a standard for reciprocity. Next, we have the voters, which are fairness in education. Fairness, we can see a justification, unfair rounds, deck participation, which destroys debate and is constitutive of the activity. Like we discussed earlier, we see the participation and constitutivity argument for fairness. Education, we see those two arguments we talked about earlier as well, that education is the sole purpose of the debate and that schools would not fund it if it wasn't educational. Now we have the paradigm issues, these last 3 down here. So drop the debater. Basically, the justifications we have here is that it's better for norm setting because if you know that you lose for reading these arguments, like you lose for reading conditional advocacies, or if you lose for being abusive in violating our interpretation, you're going to realize that, wait, I should probably not violate this in the future if I want to continue winning rounds. So it's better to set norms in debate. And also drop the argument is conditional, because obviously if you kick out of the counterclaim for dropping the argument, that's just conditionality. So that's contradictory. It goes against the whole point of the shell. This sort of dropping the argument is conditional. That's sort of special for conditionality only. There's not really other interpretations that say drop the argument is the interpretation, and that creates a sort of contradiction. Next we have no RVIs, which is you shouldn't have a reverse voting issue. The justifications here are that it's illogical since we should all be fair, i.e. if you prove that you meet the interpretation that we set, just because you're fair doesn't mean that you get to win the round because of it. And also it forces me to defend against bad norms, because if you prove that the interpretation we set is bad and abusive, we're forced to debate against that, or we're forced to continue defending the interpretation as to not lose to the RVI, and that creates bad norming in the round, which is bad. Next, we have the last paradigm issue for the round, or for this theory shell, is competing interps over reasonability, because reasonability invites a race to the bottom in judge intervention, since we can never really figure out what's reasonable and the judge has to intervene, and it starts a race to the bottom because we can always create some sort of exception in terms of reasonability and always have this sort of gap between what is reasonable and what isn't. And basically this is what a theory shell for conditionality would look like, and all theory shells will typically follow this structure: interpretation, violation, standards, voters, paradigm issues, and so on.